I'm really pleased to introduce our next panel on the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement and issues for this 6-year review that will formally commence in 2026, but is already being talked about quite a lot. First, all the way to my left is Sharon Bomer Lauritsen. She's the principal and founder of Ag Trade Strategies, LLC, a consulting service on U.S. agricultural trade policies, focused on expanding exports of American agricultural products, food, and beverages. Sharon has 35 years of government agricultural policy experience, including 26 years at the U.S. Department of Agriculture and at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. At USTR, she led agricultural trade negotiations for the United States, including for the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement and others. Next, we have Juan Carlos Baker. He's the CEO of Ansley International Consultants and a renowned expert in international trade, regional economic integration, and foreign affairs. He served in the Mexican government for over 2 decades, including as Director General for North America, Chief of Staff to the Minister and Deputy Chief Negotiator for Mexico in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and Vice Minister for Foreign Trade. He was a leading figure in the negotiations between Mexico, the United States, and Canada that eventually produced the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. And then next is Carlo Dade. Carlo is the Director of Trade and Trade Infrastructure at the Canada West Foundation and a professional affiliate at the Johnson Shoyama School of Public Policy at the University of Saskatchewan. Carlo is one of Canada's leading voices in defending and advancing Western Canadian trade interests, including developing creative solutions to major trade challenges with China and the United States. He's a frequent media commentator and writer on Pan-Pacific trade, agricultural trade issues, North American competitiveness, and Canada-Mexico relations. And this panel will be moderated by Andrea Durkin. Andrea serves as Vice President for International Policy for the National Association of Manufacturers. She is one of the nation's foremost experts on international policy, drawing from decades of experience serving in Democratic and Republican administrations. Immediately prior to joining the National Association of Manufacturers, Andrea served as Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for World Trade Organization and Multilateral Affairs. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. That was a long last title. I just want to also thank the Yeutter Institute, which puts on incredibly high quality symposia consistently. So delighted to be a part of it. And Ted, I will say this. So we live in interesting times with a lot of headlines. I went to the University of Michigan in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And I was attracted to trade because of the headlines, because of the U.S.-Japan automotive negotiations that were being conducted by an amazing negotiator, Carlo Hills. So the upside maybe of all of this is that the Yeutter Institute is producing a really important job here, which is the next generation of trade policymakers and thinkers on international trade like Matthew. So if the headlines continue to attract students into the field, I would say that's the upside of the times we're living in. So I'm delighted to moderate this first panel on a topic that is going to be vitally important and prominent for the next administration, whichever one that is, and that is the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement and its review, its 6-year review. As Jill said, we couldn't be more fortunate to have 3 people on the panel who they're familiar with the history of NAFTA, the operation of the original agreement. They were all involved in the renegotiation of it into the USMCA, so they are preeminent and have a lot to say about the agreement and projections about how the review is going to go. So let's dive into it. We have a lot of ground to cover. And I think the first thing we should tackle is the title of the panel, which is the USMCA 6-year review. So this is a novel provision for free trade agreements. And we have built into them free trade commissions. Theoretically, you're supposed to review, the parties would review the operation of the agreement however frequently they want. But this is different. So former Ambassador USTR Lighthizer wanted the agreement to sunset. So this review clause is actually a compromise approach to that. So how about we explain what is the review mechanism in USMCA? How do we expect it to operate? Maybe, I don't know, if any one of you, Juan Carlos could maybe start. Yeah.
Do I get to go first? Okay. Well, yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction and question. Thank you for having me. I was when I received the invitation to come to this to the Institute and participate in this conference. I was very excited because it's the first time that I'm here, although that I've heard a lot about the thinking, the research, and everything that it's done at the Yeutter Institute and Nebraska University in general. So thank you again for having me. And to the question, the short answer is that we don't know how it's going to unfold. The long answer is also we don't know, but let me tell you the details on that. As you correctly said, during the USMCA talks, the intention of the United States was to terminate the agreement at any given point. Some people spoke about 5 years, 6 years, or longer. Mexico and Canada as well were obviously not sharing that idea. If the US wanted to leave the back then NAFTA, it was entirely its decision, but the possibility of the US deciding when the agreement was going to finish was something that neither Canada or Mexico, as sovereign countries, would probably accept. So the compromise was that after 6 years, we were going to look at how the performance of the agreement had been, how the agreement can be enhanced, upgraded. If there are new disciplines that we wish to consider, then that was going to be the moment on it. And then a fixed date was set, 6 years after the entry into force, because the USMCA went into July 2020. That takes us to 2026. But that's the end of it. Article 34.7, Section 2, don't want to get too technical, but that's the reference. It doesn't say anything else other than the review should happen 6 years after the entry into force. So how countries are now preparing for that review is actually probably, in my mind, more important than what the article says itself. If we looked at how the political dynamics are shaping that process, that review process, then we can already tell that a couple of issues are going to be top of the agenda, including the disputes that are still not settled among the three countries. We'll get to that, I'm sure. China will certainly be an issue on the review of the agreement, and other topics that, depending on who wins the election next year, may or may not be in the discussions. For example, I'm imagining that if a Democrat candidate wins, then probably issues related to the environment will be part of the U.S.'s position on that review. If the other candidate wins, that's very unlikely. In Mexico, I cannot speak for Canada, but I'm sure Carlo will. In Mexico, the position right now is that the review does not imply a renegotiation. And this is not a semantic question. When we speak about a renegotiation, it implies that we are sort of disavowing the commitments that we undertook in the previous negotiation, and everything's on the table. I can tell you that was not the intention that the original negotiators had when they inserted that clause into the text. It was more of a, again, review. And so as to sort of separate the politics of the USMCA and everything that goes into the same basket, just imagine this. If in any of your organizations, be that the university, company, or what have you, if there's a problem that you identify, how do you go about it? You will probably try to assess what the problem is and then come up with a few ideas to fix it or amend it, implement those ideas, and then go back and see if those ideas actually worked. And then you will make another reassessment. That was the logic that we imprinted in the review process. If there's something that countries believe is not working, then let's do something about it before just terminating the entire agreement. And also, it was, and this is, I'm telling you no secret, this was very public at the time. It was also understood that if the USMCA was going to have pressures, those were not necessarily going to come from the economic and trade angle, because, and we'll get to that as well, but I would argue that the USMCA has been much more successful than any of us had imagined at the beginning, to the point that now Mexico is the US's largest trading partner. So the rationale again was, if there are all these concerns and if the review helps in terms of addressing those political concerns, then well, let's have it. But that's where we are right now.
you wanted to add to that. I wanted to also, if you can in your answer, just get into some of the specifics so everybody understands what are the terms of the agreement now in terms of the duration of the agreement, and what are the implications at, when we get to July 2026, this is the 6-year mark, what is at stake? What do the three leaders have to decide in terms of extending it? What happens if they don't decide to extend it? If you can explain that bit of it too, that would be helpful.
Oh no, you're much better positioned to do that. So I'm going to pass the buck there. But so first, I'd like to thank the Institute for the invitation too. Coming from the Canadian prairies, it's nice to finally be invited to the American prairies, to someplace other than Washington, D.C., someplace where people know the difference between the combine and the tractor. So I think I can finally have a conversation about things like swathers and not lose 9/10 of the audience. But in terms of the review of a trade agreement, we're starting to see this more with trade agreements. The idea that agreements should be living documents that have built-in mechanisms to adjust, to change, to improve. With NAFTA, with the end of NAFTA and the transition, as Juan Carlos mentioned, the idea was to prevent the Americans from just ending the agreement. It started with a negative view of trade agreements. But if you look at the TPP agreement, it includes a review. It's underway now. No one knows because it's boring, it's very technical, and it's just proceeding. But the idea there was to improve the TPP. There's clear language as to exactly what the review will do. Look at problems, find means to correct problems, look at ways of enhancing use of the agreement, look at ways of increasing the effectiveness of the agreement. So you really have a contrast in what's happening in this time period. The pending NAFTA review, or CUSMA review, sorry, what do you call it here?
USMCA.
Sorry.
There's three, yes.
Sorry, God forgive me, please forgive me for not calling it USMCA. But the views are different. And I think that you can have positive reviews. And the trick with this agreement is to try and turn the review from a negative into a positive. And I think the fact that the TPP review went on first and that Mexico and Canada participated in that review, hopefully we can bring some of that to the review of the North American agreement.
Okay, so go ahead, Sharon.
No, I'll fill in, to do a U.S. perspective as well. So getting to Andrea's last question, though, the actual process in the text says that on the 6th anniversary of the implementation of USMCA, so that date is July 1st, 2026, it says the parties will either agree, on whether to extend the agreement another 16 years, so that would be to 2042, I think. And if they don't agree, then that starts a process of actually trying to resolve differences, and they're supposed to do an annual review after that 6th review until they hopefully get all 3 countries agreeing to extend the USMCA for another 16 years. Rather complicated, I know. From the U.S., just to share what the U.S. process is, when the Congress passed USMCA, they had some very specific provisions as to what the administration has to do in preparation for the review, and the first review in particular. So the statute says that by October 1st of 2025, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office has to issue a Federal Register notice, that's our U.S. government document, inviting public comment on how to approach the review, and then as soon as possible afterwards to hold a public hearing for anybody that may want to testify on any particular issues on how to proceed. And then the next deadline is January 1st, where USTR is to submit a report to Congress, including an assessment of the operation of USMCA, precise, and they use that word, precise recommendations for actions and a position on extension, any prior efforts to resolve outstanding concerns and to include views of what we call the private sector trade advisory committees. So those are individuals in the private sector who have been appointed into special positions to advise the USTR, the Secretary of Commerce, and the Secretary of Agriculture on any trade issues. So the challenge with that is, under the statute, that's 3 months for USTR in essence to analyze thousands of comments, hold a public hearing, have all the trade advisory committees write reports, have them analyze that, get all of that information into a report to Congress, and then clear it throughout the entire U.S. federal government as well as the White House. Having tried to do that, that's not going to happen in 3 months. So I fully expect, a lot will depend on who wins the election, but I would expect USTR to actually start that process late spring or sometime in the summer, depending on how long it takes to get new political people in place. And then on July 1st, the parties are to meet to make the decision on whether to continue or not. And I think at this point in time, I don't see the U.S. government agreeing to continue the agreement. So then that would restart the annual review for a never-ending, potentially, process.
Yeah, thank you for unpacking that. And I think what you can tell from Sharon's response is because this is an entirely new process and there's not a lot of detail around it, the parties essentially will have to try to agree on how they're going to work the process. Do they engage each other as governments even before July 1? Or, as Sharon described, is the U.S. process and other governments' process going to be so complex in terms of stakeholder engagement that they come to the table on January 1 and it actually starts a conversation? So that we come back around to Ted's theme of uncertainty. This is going to be a very fraught, uncertain process, but it will be an opportunity actually for all of you and not just the cleared advisors to start talking about the importance of USMCA, for example, for the ag community. So let's shift into kind of the broader context in which all of this is happening. Carlo, you talked about this, that there's an environment in which this is all taking place. Can you describe, I think we're going to have a lot of headwinds on trade going into this discussion around USMCA specifically. Can you describe the political dynamics and kind of the general environment in which this review is going to be taking place?
Sure. I think it's probably best if we each do our own jurisdictions. Yeah. So, yeah, Juan Carlos would kill me if I started giving insights into Mexico. But in Canada, look, there's basically abject fear about the loss of the CUSMA agreement. It's occurring in the time of political uncertainty in Canada. We have a liberal government that's been in power for so long I've forgotten, that is definitely on its way out. The current government's polling numbers are in the sub-basement of the basement. We are going to have a change in government. So you have that uncertainty in the Canadian environment too. How will the current government negotiate knowing that it's not going to be around for long? What are the positions of the incoming government? And we could have an election at any time. So there is a fixed election date in Canada. It's October, but a government can fall at any time, losing a confidence motion in Parliament, a leadership change. And it's very likely that we will have a change in government. The Liberals are barely holding on. They were abandoned by their junior partner in government. It's basically a day-to-day operation as they seek support from the NDP, the Bloc Québécois, and the Conservatives are never going to support them. The Conservatives want them out now. So there's a great deal of uncertainty in the Canadian context. But look, basically it's abject fear of losing the CUSMA agreement, USMCA, of losing the USMCA agreement. That fear is out of proportion with the importance of the agreement or lack thereof for Canada. We can survive without the agreement. The economic modeling is clear, but the data doesn't translate to perception. And you see this in the States. Perception doesn't match data about trade. Great deal of concern and angst in Canada leading up to this, and it's all hands on deck. in terms of outreach to the U.S. Every premier, every mayor, every minister is in the U.S. I don't know how many visits you've had at U of N, but I'm imagining it's probably been more than 2 or 3, and you're going to get a heck of a lot more in the year leading up to the review. So our response has been take that fear and start reaching out to the U.S., not just Washington, D.C., but practically every county in the U.S. as a target for a visit by a Canadian official or by someone from Canadian industry.
And so if it's likely that there would be a conservative government coming in next, presumably before the July 1, 2026, do you have a sense of how a conservative government would view the USMCA and approach the review? What would they want out of it?
They would want, well, there are certain things that are standard in any Canadian trade negotiation. I'll just get this out of the way up front. I'm sure there'll be some commentary about it, but protecting supply management, as idiotic as it is for us, yes, and idiotic is polite. It's just a political reality. You have these political realities in the States. Your views on cotton and sugar make no sense. In Canada, our version of that is supply management. But the overall view is to limit the damage. That was our negotiating position with NAFTA, and it will remain the position with the review. We're treating the review publicly as a review, and there's great discipline across the board from government and from the media and folks like myself to only use the review word. But at home, we're preparing for a renegotiation. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. But yeah, it's going to be totally defensive. I don't see any offensive interest being put on the table. It's purely defensive. Protect supply management, God help us. And also, we may try and go after country of origin labeling, get some clarity on stronger rules to prevent the imposition of country of origin labeling. Softwood will always be on the table, but there's no real hopes of that. Other than that, those few potential offensive interests, it's defensive. Try and prevent change, try and limit damage.
Okay. Juan Carlos, let's talk about Mexico. You have a new president.
Let's talk about Mexico.
Yeah, let's talk about Mexico. You have a new president, President Sheinbaum. It was inaugurated October 1. In the Ministry of Economy, you have some new officials coming in, some familiar faces, but some new. Luis Rosendo, who's going to be managing the USMCA review, not renegotiation potentially. And he's in Washington already, has been, and is in town later this week. So talk to us about how the Mexican government is approaching this.
Sure. I think that you're absolutely right. The new president, President Sheinbaum, the first female president in Mexico, she was sworn in on October the 1st. And regarding trade and the U.S. relationship and North America in general, I think that the first challenge that she has to address, and very quickly, it's how the relationship that North America held from the Mexican perspective under the AMLO, the previous president administration, was so eroded. I think it's fair to say that the former President López Obrador, he was not really a fan of international relations, and I'm being generous, actually. So he did as little as possible in terms of maintaining and serving the North American relationship with the U.S. and with Canada. So, for example, this example that just Carlo mentioned on how the political forces in Canada are so eagerly and keen talking to the counterparts and so on, in the United States, that didn't really happen in the previous administration. So now that Claudia Sheinbaum is president, I think that the first challenge that she has is, sort of building those bridges towards the U.S. and Canadian administrations. And to do that, she certainly appointed in her cabinet people that are skilled, that are known also in the international relations arena. In the Ministry of the Economy, Marcelo Ebrard, he was former Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was Undersecretary of North America as well. So he is a person that is known in Washington. And the undersecretaries as well are persons not from ideological background associated with the party, but rather people whose technical expertise brought them to that part of the responsibility. Now, I think as well that the position that Mexico has officially stated, in the words of President Sheinbaum, is that Mexico sees this as a review and not a renegotiation. But as much as Carlo mentioned, I believe that deep down inside they are aware that certain issues, whether those are offensive or defensive, will imply a renegotiation, in the sense that amending the text just by itself would imply going back to Congress. In the case of Mexico, it's the Senate. Here in the US, it's the House and the Senate. So the narrative, of course, favors the review rather than the renegotiation. And Mexico is also very interested in having this process completed as quickly as possible. And I think it's not difficult to understand why. The longer that this process goes on, the chances of something going wrong naturally increase. And more importantly, because we also have to always remember the context, the political context on this, under which this review is going to take place, the longer that it takes, the more likely that the political context is also going to drive the process, because then you have the midterm elections, and then you always have some political cycle going on. So it's a review for Mexico. It's obviously and hopefully as soon as possible. And the third point that I would probably say on what's Mexico's position, at least articulated with the little information that we have right now, is that clearly there will be several issues on the table, but Mexico is also aware that some non-trade issues might skip into the discussion. Meaning, especially knowing how important that is for the U.S., certain issues on migration, certain issues on other topics that, at least from the technical point of view, should have little to do with the USMCA. But given how the political forces in the past few years have just been adding and bundling everything together, well, those issues are likely to surface as well.
Right. I mean, I read somewhere there's something like $100 billion of investment in Mexico kind of waiting in the wings. About half of that would come from the United States, a lot of reinvestment, a lot of expansion in production. But I can tell you from the manufacturing side, a lot of that capital is waiting and waiting and watching on the review. So Sharon, you have probably the hardest part of this question, which is, as the fulcrum in the negotiations, what does the United States want out of this negotiation? And I know we don't know which administration will be conducting it, but give us your best perspective on what the U.S. is going to want to do.
Sure, and I would like to start off by talking about some positives, right? As we look at the environment of this agreement, one of the most important things I'd like to point to was, one, it was negotiated by the previous Trump administration, but it had full bipartisan support when it passed the U.S. Congress. A tremendous amount of effort was made by the former USTR Lighthizer to make sure that there was a strong Democrat support as well as Republican. The other positive, one of the newest elements of this agreement were the provisions on labor and a rapid response system, which USTR has used extensively to try and promote the rights of unionized workers in Mexico. I'm not sensing or reading anything to suggest that there's any problems there. But obviously, the U.S. has a lot of other problems, and the other countries have problems with the U.S. Congress, we had members of Congress who were rather vocal about some recent constitutional changes that Mexico made in its judicial system. I don't understand the details because the system is to elect judges in Mexico and move to that. Well, we elect judges here in the United States in many areas. But there's obviously also issues related to energy, Mexico's new energy policy under AMLO, corn, Nebraska, depending on what happens with that case. But even if we win that case, I think there's questions as to whether there'll be any changes on the part of Mexico. Canada dairy, I personally disagree with the result of the panel report on dairy, but second to that, there's also an issue where the Canadian processors have reshaped their production to high protein dairy products and exporting those onto third markets, undermining New Zealand, US, EU, Australia, and our exports. And we have a widely held view that those, because of the supply management system, those dairy products are heavily subsidized via that. But the US sensitivities, Carlo mentioned country of origin labeling. Canada and Mexico are still not very happy with the voluntary regulation that USDA issued to deal with that. We have a very vocal and very active fresh fruit and vegetable industry, particularly in the Southeast, Georgia and Florida, that are very worried about the level of imports, not just from Mexico, but that's a lot of it, but also Canada has increased exports of fresh fruits and vegetables into the US extensively. And there's lots of arguments on both sides of this. But again, depending on which administration is in, if it's a Trump administration, I think they might try to do something because they will be pro-US farmer more so than a Harris administration. So there's lots of issues that I fully expect the US will put on the table. And I should mention China. China's the biggest one. China investment in Mexico in particular, both candidates have said they're going to renegotiate auto rules because they don't want China to benefit from this agreement by being able to put investment or sending cars to Mexico and then having those cars come up to the U.S. So these are a lot of different issues. I fully expect the U.S. won't want to do a wholesale renegotiation, but they will want to fine-tune, renegotiate certain elements, add to that agreement. I think it was earlier mentioned Harris will want to do something on environment as well. So I think we're in for a long process.
Yeah, I think that's right. So you've described issues within the agreement, so maybe some enhancements, fine-tuning, whatever terminology we might want to use. I think the auto industry might find its own words to describe that process. And there are the bilateral frictions that you just described. So some of these issues that are actually in the dispute settlement process, do they get resolved in some legal or amicable or negotiated way, or will they have will they affect the conversation around the review? And then Sharon, let's unpack the China piece a little bit more. I know Juan Carlos looks like you want to comment on this, but let's just explain what the concern is. Essentially, I think the concern is mainly on the U.S. political side about whether Chinese goods produced frankly, either in Canada or in Mexico could be a backdoor, is kind of the term that's being used, to gain entry on preferential terms into the U.S. market, leveraging the USMCA. So how do the three governments address together that concern? And how, in talking about that, Ted talked about national security being also an overlay to this. Will the three governments, or could they, decide that there are things they want to do together to collectively address mutual concerns about national security?
You want me to start from the Mexican side? All right, of course. Let me just roll back a couple of steps. I know that you have heard about the allegations that especially Donald Trump has said about these massive factories built in Mexico to export Chinese cars to the United States and so on. Well, none of that is actually true. There's not a single manufacturer of Chinese cars established in Mexico, not a single one. And the amount of Chinese investment that really has come to Mexico, it's less than 1% of the total stock, FDI stock, that has come to Mexico in the past 10 years. If you go down and you looked on the top 40, 45 largest investors in Mexico, China is nowhere to be found. So there is really no basis to what those allegations of the Mexico backdoor to China argument suggest. I would even argue, I don't want to get too technical on this, but I would even argue that Mexican goods exported under the USMCA, clearly they fulfill the rules of origin that are established in the USMCA. And thus, they are Mexican goods being exported from Mexico to the US. If we want to disassociate the origin of the capital for those goods, then we should probably start also thinking on how we are going to define Japanese, Korean, German, and other goods under that new framework of associating the origin of the capital with the export of the goods. Now, I'm not defending China. Please don't understand that. I have devoted my entire professional career to advance on the U.S.-Mexico relationship. My father was born in Minnesota. I grew up in Mexico. So I am far from arguing in favor of China. But what I'm trying to tell you is that the political narrative has become so toxic about it that now Mexico has been sucked into the same discussion. Whereas I actually believe that Mexico could be the best partner and ally of the US on this rivalry with China. I'm sure Carlo will say that it's Canada, but then we can talk about that. And having said that, if the USMCA, if we are no longer, putting the technical pieces on the side, if we no longer in North America, as Ted was suggesting, if we want to make this region far more exclusive and just solely for our purposes, well, okay, that's a discussion that needs to be had. I don't really have a position on that as well. But in any case, that discussion should be based on facts and reality. Meaning, I already mentioned that Mexico is the US's largest trading partner. You know which one is the second largest? That is China. Now, the US is Mexico's largest trading partner. You know who is the second largest trading partner of the US? China. So having that discussion of what to do with the Chinese issue should go hand in hand with other of the objectives that we are trying to achieve in the region. If that is national security, we might as well be speaking about a North American industrial policy or a North American agricultural policy. That discussion cannot be had in a vacuum of not considering other items as well. Investment, agriculture, technology, and many other things can be framed under the USMCA 2020 discussion when referring to China. But again, we also need to take into account that when that discussion happens, each country will come at the table with its own version of what the China issue is. I am very clear on what the perception is in the United States. But probably in Mexico, the perception is different. And so the perception in Canada is clearly different. So we need to find common grounds in there. I'm just saying that I'm really afraid and concerned of how toxic the China discussion has become and how it has sucked every other trading partner of the United States into that. Again, I'm not saying that there are no just threats, legitimate threats, but clearly the numbers are telling a different story.
So, yeah, if the price of oil goes up, we get number 2 back and maybe number 1 back. So don't get comfortable with that.
Agriculture.
As long as it is one or the other, I'm good with it.
In agriculture this year, Canada and Mexico will be our largest export markets. China is moved to number 3.
Well, what we have left in China after some of the policies we've been dragged into. But no, this issue about China is critical, both for these specific issues, such as dealing with autos, and the worries incorrectly, I think you're correct, about Mexico as a backdoor. Actually, incorrect in terms of the depth or the intensity of the threat of Mexico as a backdoor. There's backdoor exports coming in from Canada and from Mexico. The question is how severe or significant of a problem it is. So for real technical correctness or specificity, we can't blow away the problem entirely, and I'll talk about Canada in a second. But it's the larger issue of how we respond to the U.S. perception of the threat of China. The Americans consider it an existential threat, and they're taking concomitant measures to an existential threat, extreme trade measures and extreme security measures. Whether or not that's correct is a subject for a different discussion, but that's the reality with which we have to deal. And it's causing tensions, I think, in the larger North American relation. So when the U.S. imposed 100% tariffs on electric vehicles from China, Canada agreed before the U.S. was finished making the decision. The language we used in Canada to support our implementation using different Canadian laws and mechanisms had language from the U.S. in our public announcements about supporting the agreement. So we are not only on side with the Americans, we have become even more hawkish on China than have the Americans, to our detriment in terms of agricultural trade. So I think this creates a potential tension in North America. There's always been this tension of two bilateral relationships. Canada started with a trade agreement with the U.S. first. Mexico came in, and you're smiling, but you know the reality. You've dealt with us. There are still people in Canada that are upset that this relationship expanded to a tripartite relationship. And those voices are now only getting louder with issues like EVs. But look, if you want to find a Chinese-made electric vehicle in North America, the place to look is Canada. We've got them on the roads, running around all over the place. Tesla, the Tesla Model 3 rear-wheel drive is made in China. In the US, you get production from the US. Tesla stopped sending us American Tesla 3s and instead started sending them from China. So again, the reality versus the rhetoric doesn't match. But in Canada, our position is, look, we're 110% on side with the US. We just need to go back and clean up some issues like the Teslas. De minimis, when you raise the de minimis level to $800, there are lots of Albertan companies that figured that, I can rebundle packages from, shall we say, abroad and send them across the border. So there are issues that we have to clean up, but this is going to be a major tension. We are more on side with the Americans than are the Americans, and Mexico, for very valid reasons I wish we'd adopt in Canada, isn't, and that's going to be a tension.
Okay.
Just very quickly, I am not an auto expert, and I agree with both Juan, Carlos, and Carlo. I would just add to be aware, China is a national security threat, although I don't think trade is necessarily the way to deal with it. Having a bigger Navy and Air Force might be more sensible. But I think the issue is two things I wanted to say to what Juan Carlos said. Even though there may not be an issue now of things coming through Mexico into the U.S., that doesn't mean it won't happen in the future. And one of the luxuries of this review process is, all right, what do we see in the future that we can try and address now? The other thing to remember is autos that are coming in from Mexico into the U.S. now, they're not all coming in with the zero duty preference. Our duty on cars is, I think, 2.4%. And if an auto can't meet the requirements to have 75% North American product in it, it's coming into the United States anyway with a 2.4% because that is such a low tariff. So it's, again, not a black and white issue, but I think the reality in Congress and with either administration that may come in is China will be a part of the discussion.
Okay.
Yeah,
we're getting to the end, and I want to give them a chance to ask questions. So super briefly.
I know. Just I forgot to mention all of this that I'm saying President Sheinbaum, as much as the administration still needs to articulate fully a trade policy, she has said publicly China is not an option for Mexico. Our future lies in the USMCA. Now, obviously, there are several perks on that, but I'm just trying to tell you that really my remarks are not something that I invented. The position of the administration, as incomplete as it is, still goes on the same direction.
Very briefly, in terms of our cooperation with the U.S. on China, it has huge costs in Canada. When we put in the 100% tariff on EVs, China threatened retaliation on canola. We don't have $28 billion to hand out to U.S. farmers to compensate them for siding with the U.S. So there's going to have to be some agreement about shared sacrifice in combating China and shared aid or shared ability to weather that. With the USMCA, you put in a provision that told us not to negotiate with China. 2 minutes later, you turned around and signed a phase one trade deal with China that gave U.S. agricultural exporters specific advantage over Canadian exporters. I'm not talking about the purchase agreements. I'm talking about the changes to the rules of trade that Lighthizer negotiated. You can't go on treating your friends and allies in this manner, taking short-term agricultural gain if you want us to remain on side with you in the existential fight that's China. So I think the agricultural community is going to have to come in and, do you want our help on China, or do you want to keep us over on agriculture?
Okay, so Jill's giving me maybe 5 minutes, or maybe 1 minute, she says. So think of 1 or 2 questions from the audience, and I'm going to give you just a 30 seconds, because I don't want to end on a negative note. There's a lot that we can do as a region to continue to ensure that we are the most competitive region in the world, which we are as North America. So how do we use the review in a positive way to work on things that will unlock the benefits of the agreement? Just give me a very quick answer while somebody runs the mic around to get questions from the audience.
From a U.S. perspective, I'm a big fan of regulatory cooperation efforts, particularly in agriculture, to help smooth all of the regulatory processes, whether it's food safety, animal health, plant health, all of those things, to promote a harmonized approach on how we deal with those issues.
I know that I am going to say something that probably is not going to happen, but try to keep the review process technically driven and not use it as a way of fulfilling short-term political promises as well. And one more thing, use the experience that we gained during the pandemic, the way that Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. cooperated during the pandemic, keeping the flows of trade open, the borders never actually closed, primary and industries and others kept functioning. That is really something that we should treasure, and we should find a way to reflect that into other areas of the North American relationship.
The regulatory cooperation, that's something you can't trade away to other countries. It's a hard advantage. If you sign a trade agreement with someone else, you still have the advantage of regulatory harmonization. Your goods don't hit the border and run into problems, or don't hit problems when they're in market. It's a huge advantage. Trade infrastructure. We are the only global trade bloc that does not have an independent third party to study, invest in, and improve the movement of goods throughout the trade bloc. The Europeans have it. The Chinese have it. Southeast Asia has it. The Africans have it. The Caribbean has it. We don't in North America. You can't reshore or nearshore if you don't know how you're going to adjust the movement of goods. Building new factories, how are you going to move in inputs? How are you going to ship things between? We're flying blind on that. So one thing, regulatory cooperation, but even more important, trade infrastructure.
All great points, and I hope everybody's come away with a sense of how important the North American relationship is, and how important trade policy around the relationship is. Should we take at least one question? Just one? Okay, we'll take one from Matt.
Matt Schaefer with University of Nebraska. Curious, so in renegotiation of NAFTA, Trump administration used the Section 232 investigation on autos and auto parts as a leverage point, and Mexico and Canada were able to get some protection against future 232 tariffs in those sectors in the agreement. But now we've got maybe calls for across the board tariffs, even on other countries other than China. I'm just wondering, does Canada and Mexico view those things more as bluffs? How serious of a threat are things like that viewed as? There's also been threats of tariffs under IEEPA for immigration purposes or for John Deere for moving a factory. And I'm just curious, what are going to be the leverage attempts here in this renegotiation period, and how seriously does Canada and Mexico view those?
Yeah, the Mexican, I would argue also the Canadian, but the Mexican automotive industry did manage that protection. There's a side letter that states that if the United States violates its WTO commitments, which, by the way, the 2.5% tariff is not Mexico's to do anything. It's really the U.S.'s trade policy, and Mexico can't do anything on that. So if the U.S. decides to breach its international commitments and set any tariff above that, and try to apply it to cars that fulfill the rule of origin, I want to underline that, then Mexico will be allowed to enter paying the current 2.5 tariff and not any God knows how high tariff the administration would hypothetically set. And there's a rationale for that. We don't have time, but Bob Lighthizer, he doesn't write about that in his book, but it did happen. Now, how serious the Mexican government is I cannot speak for the government, but I can tell you my understanding of what they're studying and so on, and the vibe in Mexico is that we are taking very serious any threat, especially coming from one candidate, and you know which one that is, towards potential measures that will be taken against Mexico on the trade side, surely, but also on other policy areas, as I mentioned in a comment earlier. Is that going to give leverage to the United States during the USMCA review? I don't really know. You should probably ask a U.S. official might be in a better position to answer that question. But I can tell you that if hard pressed, this new Mexican government is much more nationalistic than others that were in office before. So if that situation, unfortunate situation, comes to happen, well, clearly Mexico will act accordingly. I don't believe that it's fair to think that Mexico will just roll over and complain. It's just not going to happen.
Okay, we have to wrap, so if you can make it really brief.
Okay, this is one. Good luck doing this one briefly. I'll try. I'll promise to try. Look, they're two separate things. USMCA is one issue, and the negotiations there and protecting the agreement. But should Trump move to adopt the global baseline tariff, this is a whole new ballgame. It's not a tariff. It is the weaponization of uncertainty. Starts at 10%, rises 5% every year the U.S. runs a trade deficit, but may be reduced by 5% if the U.S. runs a trade surplus. This is uncertainty. It's not a tariff designed to go after one industry or protect or solve one problem over a trade dispute. This is an attempt to systematically move jobs back to the U.S. If that's on the table, everything's off. We can't model the impact of a variable tariff that goes up and down. We've modeled a 10% hit, but you can't model a variable. So if this happens, it's a whole new ball game in North America. Canada probably won't retaliate. The modeling clearly indicates that we and most other countries are worse off if we retaliate against the U.S. tariffs. So we're working on strategies now about explaining to the Americans that with oil and gas, when we export oil and gas to the U.S., we export jobs. We don't export commodities. And we can tie the export of oil that we can't process in Canada because of Canadian reasons, domestic politics. Yes, there are a few other words to describe it. But instead, we export those jobs to the U.S. So rather than retaliation, at least in Western Canada, we're thinking about new ways to explain trade, as Ed said, new ways to explain trade, not as the export of goods that take American jobs, but as the export, in the case of oil and gas, we're literally exporting jobs to the U.S. I don't know what other countries are going to do. I know that Mexico is going to have a very different reaction than Canada, which will find ways to work with the U.S., not to antagonize the U.S. But that's going to be another tension in the North American relationship.
Okay, well, that was a very robust, I'm going to get yanked off the stage. Okay, that was a lot to unpack there. Thank our panelists for a great discussion on USMCA.